All right, everybody, we'll go ahead and get started if you're all set. Maybe get the last few bites of sandwich in, right? Your chips. So we'll go ahead and get started. My name's Brian Nichols. I work here at the university in the Office of Equal Opportunity and Affirmative Action. If anybody wants to participate, that'd be great, right? So I'm an alum from here at the law school. I graduated in 2010. So for those of you who don't know, the OEO, right, that's kind of the short name for our office, is the office that handles all of the university's policies related to discrimination, sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, all of those different things, right? So we're going to spend some time today talking about what all the university policies are in relation to discrimination and sexual harassment and kind of what that looks like for your time here at the U. And then you can kind of think about what that might look like for you going out into the future, right? If you have one of those, I know there's a paper sign-in sheet going around, but just for my benefit, if you could do this also, so if you pull out your phone, if you have one of those QR code scanners, you can just scan it and it'll help you sign in, or you can just go to that short little URL right there, but then it just goes straight to my office so we have a record of who is here. But basically, you know, what we're going to talk about today is really what my office does, what the university policies are related to that, especially in the last couple of years. There's been a little bit more public conversation around sexual misconduct in the workplace, right? And kind of what that looks like. And it has also trickled down to public universities, right, with Title IX. So we're going to talk a little bit about Title IX and what that does, what the requirements of that are for the university, and kind of how all of that stuff works together, right? So our office really just has kind of 4 different quadrants of what we do. So the first one is all the compliance piece, right? Making sure that the university is compliant with federal regulations like Title IX, like Title VII, the anti-discrimination statute in employment, all of those different things, right? So my office sort of oversees the university's compliance when it relates to Title IX and Title VII and different federal and state regulations that deal with discrimination, right? The second part of what our office does, sort of in relation to being compliant, is we have to do investigations, right? So my office is the office that does investigations where somebody has a complaint of discrimination or sexual harassment. So if there's a student or a staff member at the university or a faculty member who feels like they have been discriminated against or that they've been subjected to sexual harassment, our office is the formal place at the university where somebody could file that complaint. We're the ones who investigate that complaint. We talk to witnesses, we collect whatever kind of evidence we can, and we make a finding about whether or not the university's policies have been violated, right? So we're the ones who conduct that kind of neutral, objective, fact-based investigation, right? We also do that when somebody files a complaint externally. So somebody might not come to my office. They might go to the EEOC, if you've heard of the EEOC before, right? So they might go file a complaint with the EEOC. The EEOC would come to our office and they'd say, hey, we have this complaint against you. We need you to submit a response. So then we would go out and we would interview witnesses and collect whatever kind of evidence we could about that person's complaint to respond to the EEOC, right? So that's the second part of what we do, is kind of the investigation piece. The third part is to make sure that people get connected to resources, right? Somebody might not want to file a formal complaint. They might not want to go through a process, whether it's in employment or whether they're a student, right? They might just need some help. They might just want to connect to counseling resources, or they might just want to connect to the Dean of Students office and try and get some support there. So we try to get kind of, you know, be a hub to connect people to different resources around campus so that they can keep going to school, they can keep working, even if they don't want to go through a formal complaint process, right? And then the last part that we do is what we're doing today. We do a lot of training all over campus with staff and students and faculty members so that everybody knows what the policies are, where they can go if they need help, right? So that they understand what's expected of them. And I know that, you know, I've been where you are before. I was at 1L, right? Like, sometimes I feel like at law school feel like we're apart from everything else. Everything else that goes on campus doesn't happen at the law school. But just be aware, right, that like sexual harassment can happen anywhere. And just because you're in law school doesn't mean that you're not subject to the same policies related to sexual harassment, and it doesn't mean that it might not happen to you or a friend that you know, right? And so we want to make sure that you all understand what is expected of you and your behavior with your fellow students, but also where to go if something happens and you need help, right? So that's why we do as much training as we do. So when we talk about Title IX, part of what we have to have as a public education institution is a Title IX coordinator. We have to have someone that's responsible for overseeing all of the university's efforts in relation to Title IX, right? So that is Sherry Hayashi, my director. She's the Title IX coordinator. What do you all know of Title IX? When I say Title IX, what do you usually think of? Anything? Sports? Is that what you're going to say? What was that? Equality? Yeah. So most people think sports because in the 70s when Title IX passed, that was sort of like the lowest hanging fruit that it could fix, right? So like in the 60s and 70s, if I was a woman and I wanted to go to college and I wanted a free scholarship, there weren't a whole lot of sports for me to play to get a free scholarship. Whereas if I was a man, I could just play ping pong or something and get a free scholarship to go to school, right? So that was one of the very first things that the federal government said, hey, that's not equitable, right? That's not an equal treatment of men and women. So Title IX applies to sports, but it applies to every kind of gender discrimination. So really what Title IX says, it's really only, I think, 37 words long. It's like less than a paragraph, right? And it just says that no person in the United States can be discriminated against, treated unfairly, or excluded from participation in or having the benefits of any educational program that receives federal funds. That's what Title IX is. So over the years, since it was passed in 72, it's been interpreted to mean a lot of different stuff. And most recently, right, in 2011, schools, public education institutions were all reminded that it covered things like sexual assault and other kinds of sexual harassment, right? All of that stuff fit in Title IX. And then lately, if you've been paying attention with Secretary DeVos and the Trump administration, there's a whole new conversation about what regulations apply under Title IX in relation to sexual misconduct and sexual assault, right? So that's actually kind of ongoing right now. In terms of there have been some proposed regulations and the public comment period just ended. And so we'll kind of see where that takes us and what kind of requirements there are. But we have our own policies that sort of apply, right? So all of that stuff comes from Title IX. And all of the policies, whether it's Title IX or Title VII, right, there's a various, amount of different regulations from the federal government and from the state government that apply to universities like us, right? But all of those policies and all those regulations apply to visitors who come on campus, right? Even if I'm just here to go to a football game or I'm here for a Stegner Center event or whatever, right? Like as a participant in a university activity, I'm covered by the university's policies, right? Patients at the hospital, so the university has a huge hospitals and clinic system, right? I think we have like 20 or so community clinics around the state right now, and we actually have some stuff in Idaho and Wyoming, and we're starting to expand ever wider, right, with our healthcare system. But all of those patients are all covered by our policies. Customers who come to the stores or football games or whatever, right? Staff, employees who work at the university are covered. Vendors, so third-party vendors, right? They're all covered by our policies. Construction workers, all of those folks. And then students like you are covered, right? Whether you're a graduate student or a law student or an undergrad or a continuing ed student, everybody's covered by the policies. And then faculty members, right? So regardless of what role you play in the university community, all of these discrimination and sexual harassment policies apply to you, right? And apply to everybody who comes here. So again, Title IX, right, typically applied to sports, hence our picture of some female athletes up there, right? And that's the entirety of Title IX, all 37 words of it. So, and you'll notice that nowhere in there does it say anything about sexual harassment, nowhere does it say anything about sexual misconduct, right? All of that has been added over time through various regulations and interpretations from court cases, right? All of the common law stuff. So, what does that mean? What does Title IX mean? Well, it just means that people have to have equal access to education, right? Equal access to higher ed, regardless of their gender. So, it's going to include things like athletics, it's going to include career advancement, career education, employment, the learning environment in general, access to STEM programs, right? Standardized testing can't be different. Access to technology can't be different, right? And then it's got to be some distinction based on sex, which includes like pregnant and parenting students, right? If we were to just tell somebody who's pregnant, okay, see you, after you have your baby and you have to start over when you come back to law school, right? Like that would be discriminatory. We would have to figure out some way to let someone continue to participate in their education even though they're pregnant, right? We can't, have people like gender harassing people. We'll talk a little bit more about that. There's been a debate recently, if you've paid attention to this kind of stuff, about whether or not gender identity and gender expression is covered under Title IX. So the Obama administration was pretty secure in saying that it did, right? That it covered folks who were transgender or otherwise gender nonconforming, right? And then the Trump administration rolled back, whatever that means, right? Rolled back the protections for people who are transgender under Title IX. But the university's policy still does protect gender identity and gender expression, regardless of what Title IX does. Our own university policy protects that, and it did since, I think, 2008, long before it was even recognized under Title IX at all, right? But interestingly, for those of you who like follow employment law or any of that kind of stuff, there have been some cases recently through the EEOC where they've made some arguments that have been successful, that like sexual orientation and gender identity really are a type of gender discrimination, right? That if there was I think Fourth Circuit maybe, but there was a lesbian who got fired, and she said it was because she was a lesbian, and the evidence showed it was because she was a lesbian, and the employer was saying, well, sexual orientation is not protected, so we can fire you for being a lesbian if you want, right? But she made an argument, and the EEOC agreed with her, and ultimately so did the court, that really it was about her gender, that if she was a man attracted to women, she would be meeting the stereotypical definition of what a woman is, right? And so because she was a woman attracted to women, she wasn't meeting the stereotype of a woman, and so really they fired her for not matching the stereotype of what you normally think of a woman who's attracted to men. And so she won. So there are several other cases like that, and that's starting to include also gender identity and gender expression, right? If I'm a transgender person and they fire me because I'm transgender, they're really firing me because I don't meet their stereotypical definition of what a man or a woman is, right? And there have been a couple of cases about that too. So anyway, it's kind of progressing through the legal system. We'll see how it goes, but employers can always protect more than what the law does, right? And in the state of Utah, we actually do have a statute now that protects gender identity and gender expression and sexual orientation, right? All of those things are protected in employment in Utah. But all of that is all covered by our own policy, regardless of whether it's going to be covered under Title IX or not, right? We have to make sure that we prevent and address sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. So we have to prevent it from happening, and then when it does happen, we have to respond appropriately, right? Same thing with sexual violence. So ever since Harvey Weinstein happened, right, 2017, I think, October, this term, right, this phrase has kind of entered all of our common parlance, right? You hear a lot of people talking about sexual misconduct. But when you hear people talking about it, it could mean vastly different things depending on what they're talking about, right? Sexual misconduct could range anywhere from like unwanted sexual comments all the way to like sexual assault, right? It's this huge kind of umbrella term. So let's talk about what the university definition is and what fits in that definition, and talk a little bit about all of those different things, right? So sexual misconduct under university policy includes gender-based harassment, right? Sexual harassment. What's the difference between those two things, do you think? What's the difference between a gender-based harassment and a sexual harassment issue? Anybody want to guess? Nobody? Too much even Stevens? So if I was going to harass someone about their gender, what might that look like? Yeah. Yeah. Right. So the answer for those of you who didn't hear it, right, gender-based harassment might be like making comments and stuff that are derogatory or stereotyping about a gender, right? So if people were to say things like, oh, well, women aren't really intelligent enough to be in law school, right? That could end up being a gender harassment issue. It's not sexual in nature, right? And we actually get reports in our office, especially from areas like in the science fields and stuff, right, where people will say things like, oh, why are you even here, right, to women? Why are you here? You're not really into science, you know, whatever. I mean, people make all kinds of weird stereotypical comments about people that they probably shouldn't make, but that can be a gender-based harassment issue, right? Or like using really derogatory kind of graphic language to describe women, right? So like there are certain profanity terms that I'm not going to say that are gender-based and they're gender-specific and demeaning to women, right? So like using that kind of language to describe or talk about women can end up being a gender-based harassment issue. Does that make sense? Whereas if I'm making sexual comments or having sexual conversations or doing something sexual to someone, that's what sexual harassment is, right? Sexual exploitation, what's that? What do you know of sexual exploitation? I think this is one of the lesser known examples of sexual misconduct that people might not really know what it is. Anybody? So like blackmailing someone for some kind of sexual gain, right? Taking pictures of someone in a place where they would normally expect to have privacy, so like taking pictures of people in the bathroom, taking pictures of people in a locker room. There was a case at Utah State a couple of years ago where a young man was like secretly videotaping his sexual encounters with women. That would be a type of sexual exploitation, right? So that kind of stuff is what we're talking about with sexual exploitation, right? Intimate partner violence could include both dating and domestic violence, right? So it could just be partners who are dating and there's violence involved, or it could be people who live together, that's domestic violence, right? Ultimately, that's a type of sex discrimination, right? That's ultimately based on gender or based on a romantic interest, if it's an intimate partner violence situation. Non-consensual sexual contact, so that's any kind of sexual contact that's not penetration, right? That's not consensual, and we'll talk a little bit about what consent means. And then you have non-consensual sexual penetration, and then you've got stalking, right? And not every stalking issue is a gender-based issue. There was a movie, it shows you how old I am, like 20 years ago, called The Fan with Wesley Snipes and Robert De Niro. And it was like about this guy who's super obsessed with his like favorite baseball player, and he was like stalking him everywhere and hanging out at his house. And that was a type of stalking, but probably not gender-based, right? It was that he was like his favorite number one baseball fan, and he was following him around everywhere. And that was stalking, but it wasn't gender-based. Whereas if someone's stalking someone because they have a romantic interest in them, or they used to have a romantic interest in them, and they broke up, and now they're following them everywhere they go, that's a gender-based stalking issue, right? Which would also be a violation of the university policy. So all of those things fit in that big umbrella of sexual misconduct. So one of the things that we have to talk about, because it's in a few of these things, right, is consent. And there's been a lot of discussion over the last couple of years about consent. In fact, here just a couple of years ago, there was a Fordham debate about that affirmative consent should be the definition of consent for states to use, right? So there was a law school debate about that. Here at the university, we do have an affirmative consent standard, just so you all know. So the university's definition of consent is different than the Utah State definition of consent in code, in criminal law. So if you've ever looked at the Utah State definition of consent, it's not super helpful. It's like 3 paragraphs long, and it talks all about examples of what consent is not, but it never really says what consent is. So at the university, we have our own definition of consent, right? So it has to be affirmative, has to be mutual and voluntary agreement, right? That's what consent is. So it doesn't have to be verbal, right? Like somebody could give consent in a nonverbal way, but they have to do or say something that means yes. Yes, I'll do whatever XYZ sexual thing with you, not just that they didn't say no, right? So the default is no. The default is not yes. So if somebody's incapacitated by drugs or alcohol, or asleep, or passed out somehow, they can't give consent, right? They can't say, yes, I'll do that with you. So if somebody does something to them, that would be a violation. That would be a non-consensual sexual contact. Does that make sense? Okay. So ultimately, that would be a violation of our sexual misconduct policy, right? So really, when we talk about sexual harassment, there are 2 different types. So one of those things that we talked about a second ago, right, was sexual harassment as a kind of sexual misconduct. So now let's talk about the kinds of sexual harassment. So one is quid pro quo, right? So this one you'll hear all my legal people who are Latin, what does quid pro quo mean? What is it? A bargain for exchange, right? So you hear it in contracts maybe. But quid pro quo means it's Latin for something, right? You do something for me, I do something for you. So what does that mean in a sexual harassment context? I mean, you'll see the definition up there, but like, what does that look like in the real world? Do you think? Yeah. Yeah, so if a manager says to their employee, if you want to get promoted, you know what you got to do, right? You got to go out with me, or you got to have some kind of sexual encounter with me, right? That was one of the things, one of the many things that Harvey Weinstein was sort of accused of, right? That part and parcel, like a term of your employment, a term of being in a movie or whatever, was that you had to have some kind of sexual encounter with him, right? It was kind of unspoken. So that's quid pro quo, right? A manager or some other supervisor or authority, either explicitly or implicitly, says you need to do something sexual for me in order to get a benefit at work, right? And if you don't, then I might fire you or I might punish you or whatever, right? So that's quid pro quo. The other one is called hostile environment, right? And this is not necessarily from a manager anymore, not necessarily from a faculty member. It could be from a fellow student in your class, right? It could be from an employee. It could be a coworker that you work with. It could be somebody with some authority over you, but it doesn't have to be, right? But this is where somebody's engaging in some behavior at work or in the classroom or in kind of the educational environment that's sexual in nature, that's so pervasive or so severe that it creates a hostile environment for a person, right? So it basically like limits my ability to go to class or really interferes with my ability to do my job. Like I have to avoid them, all the time. I can't use the break room because I'm afraid they're going to confront me with some kind of sexual joke. I can't use the library to study because people who sit next to me are making sexual comments all the time, right? That's what we're talking about when we talk about kind of hostile environment sexual harassment. It could also be touching, right? So it could be a lot of different things. But some examples, right, are like talking about your sexual experiences that you've had with people, talking about your own sex life, right? Like school is not the place to be engaging in those conversations, right? People like who block the way, so I have to talk with them, right? Or they block the way so that I have to kind of brush by them in the doorway. They tell jokes that are uncomfortable. They keep texting you and asking you out when you say no, and they keep being persistent even after you've told them, hey, leave me alone, right? All of those different things could end up being a sexual harassment issue. But kind of a key component to all of this is it's got to be unwelcome, right? If I'm having a conversation with my friend, even if it were at school, and the conversation is welcome, right? Like we're talking about sex and I'm not uncomfortable and they're not uncomfortable, then we're not in sexual harassment land, right? It's not a violation of policy for two people to have a conversation about sex, as long as it's mutually agreed that they're okay, right? The problem becomes if you're hanging out, in an open area at the law school, you're hanging out in a study group, and two people in that group are totally fine talking about sex with each other, but the other people in that group aren't, and they have to be in that group, then it is unwelcome or unwanted for those other people, even if they're not necessarily in the conversation, right? The comment wasn't directed at them, but in order to participate in their education, they have to listen to it. That can end up being a sexual harassment problem. Does that make sense? Okay. So really it could come down to a couple of different things, right? The behavior could be visual, it could be verbal, and it could be physical. So visual stuff, right? So like things you see with your eyes. So hanging up pictures of naked or scantily clad people, right? Or like looking at websites of those things. We do occasionally get reports at our office of people like in the library, watching porn and that kind of stuff. That can end up being a sexual harassment issue, right? It's not just a violation of the university's use of technology policy. If other people have to be around you and see what you're looking at, it could also be a sexual harassment problem. Does that make sense? Like if I'm in class looking at porn, and other people who also have to be in class have to look at what's on my screen, that's not just me using the internet in a bad way, I'm also sexually harassing people, right? So graffiti of a sexual nature, like on bathroom doors, we all have kind of seen those examples of things before. If I were to wear some clothes that had some like extremely graphic sexual thing on them or something, right? All of that could end up being a sexual harassment issue that I see, right? So that's visual. Verbal is the kind of stuff you're talking about, right? Like, so verbal comments. Am I telling jokes? Am I teasing people? Am I having conversations about sex? Am I catcalling people? Making comments about people's clothes, right? That's like sexual in nature, right? So this is, a lot of times people ask me, well, does this mean I can't give people compliments? Right? And the answer is no, you can give people compliments, right? But there's like an okay way to give people compliments, and then there's a creepy way to give people compliments, right? So to say to somebody, oh, that's a really nice shirt, or I like the way you got your hair cut, or whatever, probably okay, right? But to say to somebody, oh, I really like the way those pants make your butt look, probably not okay, right? So just kind of think about the kind of comments that you're making. And if you're always, so here's kind of another like subconscious thing of Brian on his soapbox, and then I'll get off my soapbox for 2 seconds. But like always making comments and complimenting women on the way that they look, whether you're in school or at work, what's the subconscious message that you're sending? You're never talking about it with men. You're talking about it with women. What's the subtext of that? Yeah. Yeah, that what's important about a woman or their value, right, is how they look, right? So let's say somebody gets up and they give a really, really, really great presentation for moot court, right? They give an awesome oral argument. They get done, and afterwards somebody's like, man, you look really great today. Okay. But the man gets done, and they're like, dude, that was such a good oral argument, right? And if you think that doesn't happen, ask your female friends what they get complimented on. They don't get complimented on how well they do. They get complimented on how they look when they did it, right? So just keep things like that in mind, right? This hidden message when you're talking about that is that what's important about a woman is how she looks and not how she's doing. And what's important about a man is how he's doing, right? So if you want to be a complimenter, be an equal opportunity complimenter, right? Just talk about it with both men and women. But sometimes I think that our society is sort of like accultured or acculturated, if that's a word, I'm going to make it up if it's not, right, to like give people compliments when that's not really what we want to do. So like I see somebody first thing in the morning, man, you look really good. Probably what I really meant to say was like, hi, how are you? Right? So maybe just think about, am I really wanting to give a compliment, or all I want to do is say, hi, how are you? It's nice to see you, right? So think about what you're trying to do, right? And be kind of deliberate about it. Okay. Anyway, I just get a lot of things brought to our office of people like staring at their bodies, right? Like women with people staring at their chest. Like if you're having a conversation with someone, look them in their eye, right? Like don't look at their body. Kind of those different things, right? And like be conscious of where you're looking when you're talking to people. Okay. Calling somebody degrading names of a sexual nature. So like terms like slut and whore and all of those things can end up being a sexual harassment issue, right? If you all want a really good example of like what sexual harassment can be, this isn't me giving a plug for a bad show, but I'm gonna. So there's a show on Netflix called Sex Education, and every time I watch it, I'm like, this is all just an example of what people need to not do in school, right? So like sending pictures around of each other naked and making really horrible comments and drawing really nasty pictures on things. All of that, if it's at school, would be a sexual harassment issue, right? So if you want to watch a decent show and also figure out what not to do, that's a show you can watch. Okay, so that's visual and verbal, right? What about physical? So like making lewd gestures at people, right? Like physical gestures, following someone or blocking them in a doorway so they like have to rub by you to get through, unwanted physical contact. So here's the deal. We all have our own personal space bubbles, yeah? Like where you're comfortable being touched is different than where I'm comfortable being touched. And not everybody in the world is a hugger. And it is not your job to like convert people to the awesomeness of hugging. Like not everybody's a hugger. So don't just assume that when you see someone, it's a good idea to hug them when you meet them, right? Or like every time you see them for study group, you give them a hug, right? Like that's not necessarily what you should be doing, right? Because you just don't know where those other people's physical boundaries are. And what makes them uncomfortable versus what you're comfortable with, right? You might have grown up in a family that's really touchy, really huggy, or a culture that's really touchy, right? And not everybody comes from that. So just be conscious of the fact that not everybody is okay with the same level of physical touching that you are, right? So just be careful. And if somebody does ever say to you, you know what, I'm not a hugger, right? Respect that and don't force them to. Or if somebody says, hey, you know what, actually, please don't touch me, that you recognize that, right? And you kind of back off. Even if you don't think it's a touch that's a big deal, right? What's a big deal to you might not be a big deal to someone else. And it might be a big deal to somebody else that's not a big deal to you. So you just got to kind of respect when people say things, right? And be paying attention to kind of social cues, right? Like if you go to hug someone and they stick out their hand, maybe shake their hand instead of force them to hug you, right? Because ultimately, touching somebody repeatedly when they've said no, please don't do that, or I'm not a hugger, right, can end up being an unwanted touching thing that can be a sexual harassment problem. Does that make sense? Same thing with like tickling people, poking people, pinching people, right? Like, and then obviously there's the more severe ones that hopefully I don't have to tell you all, right? Like slapping people on the butt, tapping people on the butt, even if it's to say hi. Like you're all in law school, you're not playing football, right? So like what I've come to call the football high five, like when somebody does a really good job and they're like tapping them on the butt when they go off the field, like that's not, like if I get done with my presentation today and you slap me on the butt and you're like, good job, Brian, I'm probably not going to really love that, right? So just keep that in mind, right? Like context matters, right? What might be okay in one place isn't okay in another place, and you might, go down and play some football or basketball with your friends and it might be appropriate there, but it's not necessarily appropriate in every context that you're in. So just be cautious of those things, right? Exposing yourself to people, right? Flashing and mooning, all those sorts of things. Flipping up skirts, bra snapping, any kind of physical contact with someone that's sexual in nature can end up being a sexual harassment problem, right? So since you're all soon to be lawyers, right, there are things called elements of crimes or elements of offenses, right? And when we talk about sexual harassment, there are three elements. One is there's got to be sexual conduct, which we've been talking about. Two is it has to be unwelcome or unwanted. And the third one is it has to be so pervasive or severe that it creates a hostile environment. Those are the three sections, right? So even if somebody tells one dirty joke one time and it's really offensive and it's unwanted, right? Like I didn't want them to tell me that. If they only do it once, it's probably not going to meet the third element, right? It's probably not going to be pervasive or severe. It didn't happen a lot. It wasn't extremely hugely graphic, right? So one piece of conduct might not rise to the level of being a sexual harassment violation, if that makes sense. But it could be a violation of like a department standard, right? Like I could get in trouble if I told my boss a dirty joke one time, I probably would get written up, even if I didn't do it more than once, right? Or if I was having a conversation with Dean Dickey and I told some really offensive sexual joke and I'm a student, she's probably going to hold me accountable for the fact that I wasn't being very professional in my interactions with her, right? Even though I might not be violating the sexual harassment policy, I am violating what my department or what my college's expectations are of me. Does that make sense? Okay. But on the other hand, there are other things that are so severe that after only one time it is a violation of the policy, right? So like if someone were to grope somebody or grab somebody on their, sexually intimate private body parts or sexually assault someone, right, or engage in non-consensual sexual contact or penetration one time, that probably is severe enough to be a violation of the sexual harassment policy even after once, right? Like somebody doesn't have to say, hey, when you grabbed my breast yesterday, it really made me feel uncomfortable. Don't do it again tomorrow, right? Like it's already bad enough after one time. Does that make sense? Okay. The other thing I want you to think about is the difference between like intent and perception, right? 9 times out of 10, if I'm dealing with one of these issues and I call somebody into my office to talk to me about it, the first thing they're going to tell me is, well, I was just joking. I was just kidding. I didn't mean to make them feel uncomfortable, right? Well, it doesn't matter whether they meant to make them feel uncomfortable or they didn't. What matters is what they did, right? So sort of like in torts, right? Like you get your plaintiff as you find them, right? Like if I tell an offensive joke and I didn't mean to offend them, it doesn't matter whether I meant to offend them or not, I did, right? So what matters is the perception of the other person on the other side, not what I intended, right? It does have to be a reasonable perception, so you get into the whole argument of like who's reasonable and who's not, and like the whole fictitious reasonable person thing, right? But like if I were to go up to somebody and I was like, oh, those are really cool shoes, I like those. That's probably not like a reasonable interpretation of that comment is not that I was sexually harassing that person, right? Like even if they were really offended and uncomfortable that I said that, and they might very well have perceived that themselves as being very offensive, but objectively, that's not a sexually harassing comment. Does that make sense? So it does have to be kind of a reasonable perception thing. There's a subjective part to it and an objective part to it. But it doesn't matter whether I meant to or not. What matters is what I did. Does that make sense? Same thing with like touching, right? If I am rubbing somebody's back and they're really uncomfortable, I'm giving them a back scratchy. I like a good back scratchy, but not everybody likes a good back scratchy, right? And if I make them really uncomfortable and creep them out, it doesn't matter that I was trying to help them relax, right? What matters is the fact that they felt really weirded out by what I do. So just be careful about all that stuff. Okay. The other thing we need to talk a little bit about is professional boundaries in relationships, right? So we're on campus, we're all adults, and it gets really interesting when you're like, sometimes some law students are like older than the professors that are teaching them, right? And there's not like the age boundary anymore between like student and faculty, right? And there's a lot of different places on campus that same kind of dynamic is at play, right? But it doesn't matter, right? Like we're all consenting adults, right? But there is a policy at the university that says if somebody has supervisory authority over someone, whether it's a faculty member over a student or like a grad TA over a student, or a coach over an athlete or like a manager over their employee, right? If there's some kind of supervisory or oversight between those two people, there is a university policy that says relationships, even if they're consensual, are not okay, whether it's sexual or romantic, because those two things are not always the same. Right? So like even if a student totally agrees that they want to be in a sexual relationship with their professor, that would still be a violation of the university policy for that professor to engage in that relationship. And if they want to be in that relationship, they have to disclose that to their dean, and then they have to disclose that to HR and whoever, and ultimately they would have to make some decisions about before that relationship starts, if that student can go to a different section of the class, right? So that they're not working for that professor, or can an employee get transferred to a different shift so they're not working for that manager. But somehow or another, the department and the college has to take some steps to make sure that that supervisory relationship or that oversight or teaching relationship is not there at the same time, right? And violations of this policy happen when people don't report that. So like, a faculty member and a student decide they can do it totally secretly, and then all of a sudden one of those, that student's friends reports to the dean, hey, I think my friend is in this relationship with a faculty member. Who's the one that's going to get in trouble? The student? No, right? It's the faculty member's responsibility to make sure they're following that policy. And it doesn't matter, it's actually a new policy, it's policy 1-020 if you're ever interested in going to look at it, but it requires people to disclose current relationships with people and past relationships within the last 5 years. So like if I'm, a new student at law school, but I had a relationship with a law professor 4 years ago, when I got to law school and I was going to be in the class, that professor needs to disclose, hey, I had a relationship with that person 4 years ago, so that they're not continuing to teach a person that they had a romantic relationship with. Does that make sense? Okay. Anyway, so we have to adjust all those things. It's a pretty big policy in terms of like violations, right? If people violate that policy, it's not taken lightly. So just be aware, right? Like tenured faculty members have lost their positions when they violated that policy. So, but the other thing I just want to make sure that we talk a little bit about, and I think we'll get here in a minute, but especially in context of this, is retaliation. One of the reasons people don't come forward and don't report is because they're afraid of something bad happening to them because they did, right? And university policy and state and federal law all prohibit retaliation. Like, it's a pretty, like almost all now, I think it's like 80% of the cases that get filed with EEOC also include a retaliation claim, because people say, you know, not only was I sexually harassed, but when I reported it, I got fired because I reported it. So it's taken really seriously here at the university. It's actually a whole separate violation. But I just want to make sure that you understand, right, that you have a right to complain about something that's making you uncomfortable, or that you feel you're being discriminated against, or you're in a relationship that's inappropriate and somebody didn't report it. You have every right to report that, especially to my office, right, but to the dean or whoever you want to, without being afraid that you're going to get punished because you reported it. Okay? Okay. The other thing just to bring up is that location doesn't matter, right? So when we talk about sexual harassment and sexual misconduct, it could happen off campus, right? Let's say somebody's sexually assaulted. Generally, that doesn't happen on campus. Sometimes it does, but most of the time it happens at somebody's apartment or happens at somebody's house, right? Happens somewhere off campus. Even though it happens away from campus, if those two people have classes together, if they work with each other, right? Do you think the fact that the victim was sexually assaulted by someone that they have to sit next to every day might create a hostile environment for them when they come back to work or when they come back to school? Yeah, right? So it's not just where it happened and what happened, it's also the impact that it has on people when they have to be in their educational environment, right? So location doesn't matter. It could happen on a study abroad trip, right? What matters is what impact does that have on their educational opportunity, right? Okay. This part, just so you all know, every faculty member at the university, every administrator, right, every university employee actually, unless they're kind of carved out of things, is a mandatory reporter. So if a student were to report to their professor, hey, I was, subjected to sexual misconduct, I was sexually assaulted 2 weekends ago, whatever it is, that faculty member is a mandatory reporter. They have to report that to my office. So does Dean Dickey, so does the dean of the school, right? So does the manager in the department, right? University employees have to report the sexual misconduct. That doesn't mean that we're going to launch a full big gigantic investigation and that student's going to have to go through a big deal, right? It doesn't mean that. What it means is that my office is going to reach out to that student and say, hey, we heard that you reported something. Let's get you connected to resources. Let's talk about what your options are. If you want to move forward with the complaint, you can. Here's how you do it. How can we help you, right? But the big reason that we have this in place is so that we can, again, be that hub for resources and support, right, to get people connected to where they need to go. And if people aren't reporting to my office, right, then we don't have the ability to connect those students to where they need to be. Does that make sense? But just know, right, even if you go to your professor and you say, hey, can I talk to you for a minute, but I want you to keep this 100% confidential, if it's about a sexual misconduct or discrimination thing, they can't keep it confidential. They have to report it to the OEO. Okay? Okay. And then, again, once it's reported to us, we reach out to that person, make sure that they know about our office and other university resources. We have full-time victim advocates on campus when it's related to sexual misconduct and sexual violence, right? So we get those victim advocates connected to them. And then whether or not they want to respond to us or whether they want to engage with us is up to them, right? I can't make them do anything, but at least we've reached out and let them know kind of what their recourse is or what their possibilities are, right? Okay. If you go to our website, this is what our website looks like. So if you ever need to know, like, that's where we are, right? If somebody ever does tell you about sexual misconduct, right, just be supportive for them, right? Like, studies have kind of shown that the first response that someone gets when they report sexual misconduct is likely going to have a huge impact on what they do next, right? So if they tell their friend, because that's the other thing, they're much more likely to report to a friend or a classmate or a roommate than they are to a professor or a teacher or a dean, right? They're much more likely to tell you. So you being supportive and being there and helping them navigate the system is really important, right? If your response to them is, are you sure? Are you sure? He seems like a really good guy. I don't think that he would do that. Are you sure? I've never seen her do anything like that, right? Like if you ask those sorts of questions, they're going to be much less likely to seek out support from other people, right? Whereas if you say, oh man, I'm so sorry that happened. How can I help you? Right? That's a much better response for your friend, much more supportive, right? Okay. Again, we talked about what happens when a report is made. We just want to make sure that they're safe. We might need to help like apply interim measures, right? Do we need to move people out of the dorms? Do we need to move people classes just to try and help give some separation and some space for people, right? We can do all of those different things. Once we get a complaint, we assess the complaint, right? We assess that report. Do we need to do anything about it? It's kind of a triage thing, right? Like what are the immediate things we need to do now that we have this report? Sometimes that might mean we need to do an investigation, right? Somebody might file a complaint and we might need to investigate it. We'll talk to witnesses, collect evidence. Ultimately, we issue a report that kind of lays out what our findings are of that investigation, right? And then all the parties have a right to review that report. They all have a right to respond to that report, provide additional evidence. And ultimately, if they disagree with it, they can request a hearing in front of a university system. So when you hear like due process, that's what due process at the university is, right? Like people have a right to provide, evidence in their defense and all of that stuff, right? And then if it does go to a hearing, it's a review by a committee. That committee then makes a recommendation to the VP. The VP decides, do I uphold what the committee said or do I not? And then if somebody disagrees with what the VP says, there's a final appeal to the president if they want. Okay. Just really fast, how many of you have heard of bystander intervention before? Okay, so quite a few of you. What's the concept of bystander intervention? Anybody? In like a blurb. Yeah. Yeah, so his answer was a requirement for like a third party to intervene or call the authorities or something, right? And at the university, we don't have a policy that like requires bystander intervention, so we don't have like a requirement for it. But it's a way to kind of minimize additional harm from happening, right? So instead of just being a person that like watches something bad happen to someone, you do something to stop it from happening, right? Or if it does happen and you don't feel comfortable intervening at the time, that afterward you follow up with someone. You say, hey, are you okay? Can I help you? Are you all right? I saw that happen, right? But if you do feel comfortable intervening at the time, right, it might prevent something really bad from happening. So let's say you're at a party and you see somebody kind of passed out on the couch and you see somebody sitting next to them kind of all over them, right, like making out with them, touching them, whatever, and you can obviously tell that they're like sleeping while someone is touching them. A bystander intervention thing, right, might be like, hey, you might want to wait. You might want to stop. You might want to leave them alone, right? If you don't feel comfortable directly kind of confronting them about that, you could always do some other thing to break up the pattern, right? Like you could go ask that person, hey, have you seen so-and-so? I haven't seen my friend all night. Have you seen where they went? You can do something, right, to kind of break up what they're doing. And it does two things. One, it stops the pattern from happening, right? So like you're interrupting what they're doing. The second thing it does is it actually puts them on notice that like other people are around and seeing what they're doing, right? And you'd be surprised how much people's behavior changes when they know they're being watched, right? So there's different levels that you can do, right? There's like direct confrontation, like, hey, get your hands off that person, they're sleeping, right? You might not feel comfortable with that level of intervention, but then there could be second level, right, where you could be like, hey, have you seen my phone? I think I left my phone on this couch earlier. That breaks up the system, right? And then kind of gives you a chance to get that person away or whatever. But there's different levels, and you can choose what you want. And if you don't feel comfortable doing any of that stuff, that's fine. You don't have to. But just think about it's a way of kind of mitigating harm for other people, right? But also standing up for like what's a good role model and a bad role model with behavior, right? So like if you're in a study group and somebody makes some really raunchy comment about the way somebody looks, or, oh yeah, I heard that person slept with so-and-so, they're such a slut or whatever, and you hear that kind of comment, it's okay to then say, hey, you know what, that's not cool. Like, you have no reason to say that about that person, right? Like, call them out on the bad behavior, right? Like, be a good role model in your own behavior, and then call people out when they're behaving badly, right? Okay. We talked about retaliation, right? It's all prohibited. My poor little guy shaking his head like, no retaliation, right? Okay. Questions about any of the stuff we've talked about? I know we've talked about a lot. Anything? Okay. One other thing I just wanted to mention real fast, we spent all of today talking about sexual misconduct and kind of discrimination based on sex and gender, right? But the university policy protects discrimination on everything, right? So race, national origin, ethnicity, skin color, sex, religion, disability, veteran status, sexual orientation, gender identity, all of those things, right? Age, religion, everything is protected by Title VII, everything's protected by the Age Discrimination Act, the ADA, all of that stuff is all protected, and it all comes to my office. So just one other thing that I like to make sure that I tell students, especially in relation to the ADA, is like if you have a disability, right, and because of your disability you need some kind of accommodation in class, or you're working and you need an accommodation in your job, and you work on campus or whatever, you can request accommodations to help you, right? So like if because of a disability you need something in your classwork, you go to the Center for Disability and Access, it's up at the Union. If you need like, you know, if you have a disability and you need additional time, or you need a screen reading software, or any of those sorts of things, right, you go to the Disability and Access Center. If you by some chance work at the university, right, like you have a fellowship or you're a research assistant or whatever, and you need some assistance in your job, then you can go talk to HR about, hey, I have a disability and I need some accommodations to help me do my job, right? So I think a lot of people don't understand that you can, if you have a disability and you need help, that there are places that you can go to ask for help, and that it's actually a requirement of the law for your employer and your educational institution, right, your school, to provide you with those accommodations if you need them. Okay? All right. Anything else? Any other questions? No? You're all going to go sleep, eat another do-gooda, or a turkey bird or something. I don't know. They call their sandwiches such weird things. Okay. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Have a good night. Good day. What's that? No more help from me. All going to jail.